Good Tuesday afternoon to you. Tuesday evening. What a great couple of days. We are going to try and talk to you about navigating the digital advertising ecosystem in 2021 and beyond. Something that you've had some great input from all the great speakers so far here at ALM. And I am joined by my partners, Mike Signorelli and Tara Potashnik. We are probably not in this panel going to get us through the pandemic, but we're with you. We're going to get there. We're going to get there soon. We're looking forward to being in person with all of you next year at this wonderful event. And today we're just going to really talk to you about the confluence of developments around identity, DAA, PRAM, P4A, all of those acronyms we've come to know and love in working with all of you and at IAB and with our colleagues in the other ad trades to try and give you a sense of the challenges and the responses that we are working on and trying to get things to a navigable and stable position again. So without further ado, let's get started. So we are navigating the digital ecosystem. We'll jump on to our next slide here. There we go. So yes, some familiar sites. The great state of California, which of course brought you the CCPA and the CPRA to come in recent years. You see the cookie. Cookie is on its waning days, and we'll see what's next. The great state of Virginia just decided to get into the game, and don't worry, there's 48 states left, and maybe some territories, and of course the Congress. But we think there is a path through all of this, and it's a really exciting time to be in our industry, in this ecosystem, and navigating this complicated landscape, but to a good place, to a better place, to a better mousetrap on top of all the good that the current mousetrap has done and built for society, an even better mousetrap. And so we're going to talk through some of the challenges that we're facing and some of the potential solutions. So the key threats facing our ecosystem, of course, there's the elimination, deprecation, changing of standards on the IDFA, and Apple and Google's multiple announcements, including last week on third-party cookies last week, the most recent one that their ad buying platform is not going to be accepting or using third-party cookies at some point in the future. We've got challenges that are coming from default browser controls, developments being discussed at various forums. Certainly you have defaults with Apple that have always been either restrictions or opt-ins, and Google is talking about changing their Chrome settings. And then, of course, you've got developments in California about standardized browser applications that would block the use of a lot of the great technologies that the business community has relied on. And so you've got a patchwork of different technology, business standards, and legal standards, and a very fluid regulatory landscape, and a federal legislative landscape that might help us resolve all of this in an effective way for all of us. On to the next slide. So the forums of activity that we wanted to really dive in deep with you today, and you've heard about these throughout the last 2 days, but is PRAM, industry actions and development around PRAM, the Partnership for Responsible Addressable Media, which of course is an initiative driven by the IAB as a leader in it, the ANA, the 4As, the NAI, and others in leading member companies of the various organizations, many of you that are out there today watching and participating. And a lot of work going on in PRAM, in how do we build that better mousetrap for advertisers, for media, as the IDFA and cookies deprecate and we go into the next generation of of the internet, replacing all that's been built over 25, 30 years. So we'll talk a lot about that. We will also get into the details about efforts for federal preemptive law, a federal preemptive privacy law. Of course, we have Privacy for America, another initiative led by the IAB, the ANA, the 4As, the NAI, but your industry associations pushing together for a uniform standard. The IAB has been driving this for many years with its colleague trades. And we think we've got a great initiative that we've developed, again, in conjunction with many member companies, working collaboratively with members of Congress, Federal Trade Commission, and staff, and otherwise, to get a really strong framework to advocate for in that legislative debate. And then the states, similarly, there is a coalition for the states. IAB has been central in it. Mike is going to talk you through that. He's serving as the lead counsel on that effort for much of the state legislation and ballot initiatives that are being considered, but there's a lot of activity there, and you should know your trade association is front and center in representing you across all of these paths, hopefully bringing all of it together in a way that is driven by the whole business community, driven by the membership, driven by the trades, working in conjunction with policymakers with different business models in an area that we emerge better than we went into what we're having to navigate here. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague.
Thanks, Stu. We're going to take a deeper dive now into some of the industry activity that's taking place. And I think it really starts with an understanding that our industry has a rich, successful history of collaborating to taking on complex policy issues, whether it was the Digital Advertising Alliance solving concerns around transparency, control, and tracking and profiling, or the Trust Accountability Group tackling click fraud, ad fraud, and piracy issues. We see industry across many different industries and stakeholders and business models working together under the banner of the IAB and other trades to doing the hard work and solving issues that I think affect all of us, not just as businesses, but as consumers and citizens in our society. And the first one we're going to look at is the change in addressable media and the partnership for responsible addressable media, and how industry, again, is come together through the trades, trying to solve a very complex issue involving technological changes and grappling with first what would be the deprecation of cookies, but also changing to device identifiers and availability of being able to maintain identity across channels and deliver addressable media to consumers to help support the rich array of services and products that are available on the internet. And here we have the vision of PRAM, and it's to ensure that consumers and businesses can continue to connect responsibly, enjoy the benefits of the digital economy, and a safe and effective cross-media environment where privacy is fundamental. And those two drivers to ensure the connectivity from brands with their audiences and making sure on the second part that this is done in a privacy and safe way have been the two pillars driving the initiative, which has brought together companies that are data providers, brands, agencies, publishers, truly the entire ecosystem across four different fronts, looking at different aspects of addressable media, from technological concerns, business interests, privacy, policy, legal, and also communications and education, all of it driving to the overall mission, which I'll hand it over to Tara to talk about the different working groups.
So I think you were on a roll there, Mike, so keep going. But
I'll follow the cue from the slides. Go right ahead.
There's a wealth of talent with you all in your companies, and the way we're tackling PRAM is in 4 different working groups so that we can put your talents into these different groups. The first is the business standards group. So we've got professionals coming together from across your companies that are looking at what are all the different business use cases where that you currently use the cookie and the IDFA, and where would you anticipate needing to be able to use this new addressable media identifier? And that working group has worked tirelessly. I think it's over 100 pages right now worth of use cases that they've got that they're compiling and distilling down into something that's workable. Meanwhile, over in the privacy policy and legal working group, which Venable is involved with helping to lead this working group, we're working on establishing a framework that Mike will go in and Stu will go into more detail on to ensure that this new addressable media identifier that's being developed will have the proper privacy policy, legal guardrails that you would want in this next generation of the infrastructure that underpins the internet. And then meanwhile, we've got the technical standards working group, which is for all of those that have the technical background to actually put together and determine what this AMI is going to look like. And then the last working group is the communications and education working group. Stu, you look like you want to say something.
Yeah, I just add on a little bit. So it's interesting, we've developed these working groups, and for many years, with a lot of talk with the IAB and Randall Rothenberg, who, as you know, all know has been a real leader in thought leader in thinking through a lot of these dimensions. It's interesting that PRAM has become a place where a lot of the different threads we've been working on over the years, P4A, Coalition for Better Ads, TAG that was mentioned, regulation, potentially regulation of browsers and others, have all coalesced into a place where we have the real chance to paint that right vision and platform for the future, much like what happened in the era when the railroads came to the United States, and ultimately there was regulation that figured out how to all make it all work. Same thing when pharmaceuticals were something new at the turn of the previous century, and you at some point got a Food and Drug Act that really set the stage to allow all of the success we've had in pharmaceuticals and benefit to society. And there's a real opportunity here, given the complexity and the state of the evolution we're on, to actually leverage all the good work that's been done over the past decade plus with our good partners, with Randy and the IAB, with David, of course, now in the role of the IAB, some of our other great folks, Dave Grimaldi, our friends at the other trades, Bob Leodiz, Dan Jaffe, Marla Kaplowitz, Lee Freund. A lot of people have given a lot of thought to get us into the right place to tie all these things together, and we're thinking this is the real chance. Go ahead, Tara.
All right, and I just wanted to let you know that our dear friend Randall is actually here, so shout out to him. But we wanted to elaborate on one working group in particular, the privacy policy and legal working group. We know that you've heard in your previous panels about the business use cases and some of the technical work that is going on through the IAB Tech Lab. So I will hand it over to Mike to elaborate on what we're doing in this working group.
Thanks, Tara. I think we might have one slide in between just to give you a sense of the companies that are participating in this effort here at PRAM across all four working groups that Tara shared, as well as on many of these on the governing board. And you can see the trade associations throughout here, but you really could see the broad cross section of companies that are engaged. Again, from premium brands, premium publishers, data companies, platforms, agencies, across the board. It's quite a remarkable group, intellectual capital that's involved in this effort. If we go to the next slide, you can see the principles that are being developed through the privacy policy and legal working group. And we have here 5 principles that we have developed with industry that would govern the use of the addressable media identifier, which we call the AMI for short. This process started last summer, and we've been meeting weekly to develop this. And behind each one of these principles is more detail and more information. This is just the highlights to summarize what we've been focusing on. And the first principle is ensuring the availability of the AMI to the marketplace, ensure that it's there on equal, fair terms for all companies to use for business operations, that there's no favoritism or favored access to the AMI. It's really meant to be an industry utility used to support addressable media and reaching consumers and engaging with them in digital media across multiple channels. The next principle is the operability of addressable media identifiers. We want to have a reliable identifier available in the market, free from interference from gatekeepers who can throttle on and off the availability of the AMI. And so a key principle is ensuring that an AMI that's being provided in accordance with our principles and used in accordance with these principles should be free from interference and be able to use and be operable across the marketplace. The third principle is the permitted uses of the AMI, and this is the key distinction of how the market's going to change. Today, the main currency is the cookie. There are little controls over how it may be used and accessed. It's very open, which has been one of the foundational principles of the internet that has let it grow and be commercialized in the way that it has today. The market is changing and looking to put more control over the addressable media identifiers and being able to reach consumers in different ways. The permitted uses will identify a set of use cases from help and consultation with the business working group. It'll identify those uses that may only be used with the AMI, or another way to say it is the AMI may only be able to use with permitted uses identified by PRAM. And those will include optimization, operations, data personalization, data advertising, a whole host of critical and vital use cases in the market like fraud prevention, but then also prohibiting certain uses and not allowing the AMI to be associated or used with certain data steps, data sets, or activity. So really locking down and putting safeguards around the AMI. The next principle is around transparency and then one on choice. A hallmark of industry has always been, in the efforts by industry, is to have responsible data practices, ensuring that there's transparency, enhanced transparency, leveraging the assets the industry has invested in, like the Digital Advertising Alliance icon for enhanced notice, key attributes like that, tools for allowing consumers to turn on and off uses of AMI, and along with expressing other preferences, and having ultimate control over the use of the AMI. And finally, most critically, is having true accountability and oversight around the AMI and making sure that there's accountability for the provision of AMI, the use of AMI, and the operability, and having the right mechanisms in place for the monitoring and assessment of those activities.
Right. And so Tara referenced the technology working group. We should give a shout out to Dennis Buckheim and the Tech Lab, who's been driving that. And in fact, at some level before PRAM's, well, certainly been driving it before PRAM's creation, but even efforts to address this for a while. And there's a real strong interplay necessary between the policy and the technology angle. And then, Mike referenced things like the DAA and Lou Mastry, a lot of the good work that's been there in standards and choice, but we've got to bring that current to the new reality of the various frameworks we're doing. And so PRAM and the umbrella around PRAM with Bill Tucker driving a lot of the different pieces to try and keep us all organized. Another thing that I'll just highlight on PRAM before we move on, just as referenced, there's been a lot of talk even in this couple of days, but certainly in the last week around Google's announcement that I referenced earlier about what they're going to be doing in their ad buying platform. And, the more we kind of think about the reaction to that and to PRAM and the relationship to that, the more it actually becomes obvious that, look, there are going to be multiple approaches to trying to create the better mousetrap. We've known that. Google's been talking about that for a while. And whether it's Google, whether it's what Apple's doing, and anyone else who comes about, we saw an announcement recently from Brave in a similar way. But what's critical is to do what we've been doing in the various forums that we've talked about, driven by the trades, which is really their role for the ecosystem. It's a primary role of the IAB is to develop consensus among industry stakeholders in a way that furthers the whole industry, puts the whole industry in a better spot, and provides much more utility and strength to consumer offerings and all the benefits that come with it. And so, an obvious evolution of PRAM is to ensure that all of those perspectives are being looked at, and policies and parameters looked at, pressure tested, tires kicked in the same way as we develop this alternative identifier. So I know there'll be more dialogue on that in the coming weeks, but it's important. It's important that there's strong scrutiny and participation from all the stakeholders, and that has been what's been so successful in driving. That's what standards are about. Driving standards, whether they're in law, technology, policy, alternative regulatory structures. Okay, so should we jump on, Mike? Anything? Go ahead, Tara.
Oh, I was going to say, before we get into the details of federal advocacy, we do have a question from the audience specifically for you.
Great.
That will turn a good segue into federal advocacy. So from the audience, Congress and the regulatory agencies as well as anyone. Historically, industries fight legislators tooth and nail to prevent regulations from passing. Here, our industry has been asking incessantly for regulation and legislation to level the playing field and give everyone clarity. So what will it take for us to pass comprehensive privacy regulation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, led by IAB, ANA, the other trades as well. I want to shout out to all of them because there's been a real collaborative effort. Had the foresight a couple of years ago and put the resources behind developing a strong approach in P4A, which you'll hear about, but calling for federal law in this area. We pushed out and called for it before a number of members even had called for it. In a way, industries, as the question articulates, usually fight it. But we did that because of the recognition of what we've seen in developing the standards and the importance of it, both domestically, to not have 50 different standards, but to have a uniform and consistent federal approach, an approach that allowed everybody to follow the same rules that are fair and capture all the points of view, led by consumer points of view, and to put that forward. So what do I think the chances of a law passing? I get that question a lot, and I give the same answer every time because I'm definitely right on it, which is it's 50-50. Either it will or it won't. I think there's as good a chance, I say that jokingly. I've been doing some of these videos. I can't ever tell if I get any laughs, but at least I can still laugh at myself in these pandemic times. But, there is as much a chance as there's ever been because of the alignment of the business community that we've worked so hard to achieve, particularly in the media ecosystem and the advertising ecosystem in the IAB world, working a lot with Dave Grimaldi, of course. And we think there's a real chance in this Congress in the next 2 years to get there because there's been a lot of intellectual capital that's pushed forward on it. It's hard to pass laws on anything, as you all know, given the politics of the country right now. But this is an area where you can get bipartisan agreement and bipartisan desires to get something enacted. And if you think about it, we know for sure in talking to policymakers, and you've heard from some of them already in the last 2 days, and you heard yesterday from Senator Wyden, but we know, Senator Wyden, we know that the committees of jurisdiction are going to take up federal privacy this year, and frankly, maybe even this spring or this summer. It is a priority. And we've got to work together and make the case for what we need, make the strong case to push the approach that we've worked through in Privacy for America, which is to move beyond this old paradigm of opt-in or opt-out. We call that the old paradigm, and into the paradigm. Of course, you'll preserve choices for consumers, but defining what are the appropriate uses of data, what are the wrong uses of data, the same way other regulatory structures have been developed over the years. And so when Privacy for America was convened and coalesced, it was with a notion we needed to get the top companies in the country top stakeholders, top trades, to provide for consumers strong and comprehensive data protections, clear rules of the road that would apply for all businesses, all individuals, and law enforcement, to stop, restrict, prohibit harmful and unexpected data practices while allowing the beneficial practices that our membership in this industry preserves. The old goose that lays the golden egg. Let's preserve the golden eggs and the goose, and shift away from this notice and choice paradigm, but to really a common set of norms about what practices are prohibited, what are permitted. I'd encourage you all to go to privacyforamerica.com. You can see the detailed blueprint, and you can get involved. Next slide. So as we wait the next slide, oh, we skipped one, I think, but that's okay. So the framework, the key provisions, there's prohibitions on data misuse, which I referenced earlier. So things like discrimination would be prohibited, eligibility discrimination, eligibility determinations prohibited, fraud and deception, stalking, use of sensitive data without express consent, and special protections for tweens. And I think there's actually an overlay here of PRAM and responsible uses around an identifier that can further put walls around the media ecosystem's use of data and alternative identifiers. Strong enforcement and oversight. For the first time, the industry has called for a FTC Bureau of Data Protection, strong staff, resources, rulemakings, approved certifications, recognition of those permitted practices that are so important to deliver consumers products and services and advertisements of things they want at the time they want them. Strong AG enforcement, that's what is coupled with the preemption, and civil penalty authority. Accountability and transparency has always been a hallmark for this industry. Privacy compliance plans, vendor and third-party oversight, data security, data personalization, opt-outs, and then a comprehensive legal scheme. How would this law interrelate with all of the laws that already exist, of which there are 20 to 30 privacy laws in little different pieces throughout federal law as it is.
So,
all right.
Stu, you were talking about prohibited and permitted uses. And so we have a question from the audience about the notion of creepiness. And the question is that the notion of creepy tracking isn't clearly segregated from creepy targeting. Do you foresee the upcoming laws being able to differentiate the two concepts? And can you give us clear guidelines, or will this be a market-driven challenge?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's one of the questions that's at issue even in the PRAM dialogues right now. So there's been tracking, and I would say non-creepy tracking, like the fact that I'm in the market for a car, and then I start getting advertisements of car specials. In fact, I bought a car at one point based on that. It worked, and it was great. It told me about a particular car that I was interested in that had the headroom that I was told that I didn't know existed, that had just come onto the marketplace. I don't find that creepy. I think it was novel for many years, but society's come to accept that. I think there are other things that people aren't comfortable with that are creepy. So we have to find the sweet spot there to delineate the value and what's acceptable from stuff that just bothers people. To date, that's all been around choice. Give consumers choice through the DAA. The DAA choice has been effective. It's been viewed hundreds of millions of times. The icon has been served trillions. The icon is like better than McDonald's cheeseburgers, like trillions served. I mean, we're just past that. It's widely known. But there have been 20 million consumers that have exercised choice around the world, that and hundreds of millions that have pursued the website. So there's something there. It may be that standard in PRAM gets evolved, it gets developed, either with more granularity for preference managers of types of advertising to narrow it and make it transparent. A lot of great companies are doing that right now. Facebook has great transparency preference managers. Many companies do. MediaMath, Google. I mean, you go down a long list. but you could build more of that into there. And it may be that the business community decides maybe there's a better way of traditional direct marketing that can get away from the across sites over time stuff, if that really gives people, if that's not a far enough, but that's a far bridge from just eliminating all of this stuff altogether. So I think that's going to be an interesting discussion. It's been a discussion that's been going on for a number of years, and it's ripe again right now. And we'll see, what the desire is for consumers, what the impact is on the economics. Of course, I gladly, for one, would be happy to get ads about a car I'm interested in by people who know I'm in the market for an ad, and then all the great free offerings and content that come along with it. And if I have the choice, get away from that. But I think that is going to be an inflection point.
I think also to add, what's exciting about this moment in our industry is we're getting a chance to do better, to rewrite the rules, whether it's through technology, PRAM, legislation. We get the help to define how to do better by consumers, how to do better by our industry, how to do better for marketers across the board. And I think that use case of when does it become creepy or not creepy is something that we get to actually help define and set. We had talked about using AMI and creating preference managers and tools. That's part of the conversation that we're hearing around the tables. Can we give more control to the individual to state their preferences? I bought a car. I don't want to see car ads anymore, but I am interested in outdoor fire pits. So I want to continue to be advertised in this way. Those are the conversations we're having at PRAM and that are having the business working groups having, the policy group. And that feeds into our conversations, whether it's at the state or federal level, when we're talking about legislation, ensuring that data can continue to be used for good and for value and putting the right controls around it, like what we see here for P4A, to making sure that certain uses are just prohibited, taking that away from consumers so they don't have to worry about data being used for fraud or deception. You should never be able to opt into that. That should be an easy, clear standard.
And I think that's one of the great things about the new paradigm that we talk about in Privacy for America, which is I get on an airplane, I just want to know it's safe and that it flies. I want to get there. I don't need to see the underpinnings of how it all works. And so if we can define what's safe, what people want, and one of the great things, this has always been the case, I think we don't get enough credit for it as an industry, but the industry and the tables that we're around, everybody is saying we want to do right by consumers. How do we do that? Consumers have different points of view. They're willing to exchange in different values and trade-offs, which is why there's been so much discussion over the years around choice. Empower consumers to make their own choice. Tell them what you're going to do. But in some cases, that hasn't been enough. Back to the, look, let's take some things off the table. Or if you think about an AMI in the PRAM context, look, that's going to be something of the industry's creation just for addressable media and privacy protective addressable media with the benefits. So this area of creepage or uses outside of the responsible industry goes away as long as we can build that right accountability and control into the ecosystem. So I'm very excited about where we are. It can be frustrating, I know, for all of us to figure out how we get there and the challenges within individual companies and just even the unknown as you're trying to develop products and do what you do and meet quarterly quotas and all of those things. But it's a really exciting time to be in our space for the reasons Mike described, to really figure out what those rules of the road are in a way that that everybody wins. And there, we know that there is that sweet spot. We just got to hit it. So with that, Mike, why don't you, a lot of this, the states are that laboratory of policy development, and a lot of this is being really discerned at the state level right now. Why don't you update us on where things are in the states?
Sure. We can advance to the next slide. So I've seen this slide many different ways. This patchwork of color, I've also seen it completely filled in a solid color. And there's different ways to really take a look at what's happening from state to state. And I think this is probably the best illustration of what the world could look like year end or sometime next year, a true patchwork. A year ago when we were looking at a slide like this, there may have just been 3 states colored in: California, Nevada, and Maine, the 3 states that had recently passed privacy legislation. And at the the end of last year, half the states were colored in because they were considering privacy legislation, but those really had stalled for the most part due to COVID and the impact in being able to hold regular order in the different state capitals. This year, 3/4 of the map is colored in for states that are considering privacy legislation. And we've seen recently the Commonwealth of Virginia passing legislation and now becoming the 4th state, but really the 3rd with a more omnibus approach to consumer privacy. But this really gets its starts out west in California due to a real estate developer who put a lot of money in moving a ballot measure and putting pressure and breaking through with some privacy legislation and working that then through the legislature, through rulemaking, and then a second ballot measure, this time not off-ramping it, but taking it right to the people to vote. And they passed this past November with the CPRA adding to the mix. And I think everyone's probably very familiar, been on a bunch of webinars on the CCPA, CPRA. I don't think anyone can make heads or tails of all the operational requirements that are there. And I say that because what we've seen develop across the country in other states is a break from the CCPA. We're not seeing states follow that model. We are seeing a lot of states take a privacy rights approach, but those rights are really name only. And the standards themselves are different, quite different on how do you operationalize access, deletion, opt-out, anything along those lines. And we're seeing a new model developing, one based coming from Virginia, but its roots come from Washington. We've seen it in Utah, Minnesota, Colorado, and many other states in between as being the sort of starting place. But again, seeing a different flavor. I'll highlight a couple of different jurisdictions just to kind of give you a sense of the developing patchwork and what we're looking at. In North Dakota, it's an opt-in bill, an opt-in for the sale of personal information. Those terms aren't defined, but personal information does include some examples like hometown. I don't know what hometown means, but if you sell it and you do it knowingly, there's a private right of action where you could be on the hook for a violation of a fee up to $100,000 per violation. Now, it's just a bill. It hasn't moved through, but it's a very targeted bill to about 10 data elements without any kind of concept of sale, but that's a proposal there. In New York, we've seen ideas around data fiduciary obligations, a concept that we've seen in Congress that look to impose a duty of loyalty with respect to data to a consumer, that you would only use the data in their best interest. An interesting idea, but a challenge to how do you operationalize that as a business when you're operating nationwide, and how you think about a duty of care versus when do I provide access to household data? Does that violate someone else's rights if I hand over data to someone else that happens to be a roommate in that household? In Hawaii and New Hampshire, we've seen bills that focused on opt-in for web viewing with PRA or opt-in for location data. Same in Montana, but not defining the key elements as to what would be subject to those requirements. Texas was an opt-in bill across the board for all processing. That moved to a study. We're expecting legislation to be introduced. But what I just want to drive home is that there is little harmonization. And that's what we've been working on, particularly with IAD and its sister trades and their ad trade coalition, harmonizing the standards from state to state. We recognize that legislation is going to be moving. Someone had asked a question, fighting it tooth and nail. That's not necessarily the posture of industry. It's trying to work to make sure it's the right standards for consumers and the right standards for business, and harmonizing those standards nationwide while we work for a national preemptive standard through Congress. And it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge to educate, to try to bring some harmony to the rights, to ensure that deletion is the same in California as it is in Minnesota, Utah, and Florida. And it's not an easy conversation to have, particularly with short cycles, 3 months in, 3 months out, and working through those. But we've had some success. We were actually pretty successful in a number of states, but mainly in Virginia to help bring, I think, some responsible and appropriate standards for industry to help guide practices.
Mike, you've talked about the patchwork that's developed beyond California, but we have a question from the audience about, should we worry that the California delegation in Congress is so enamored with the CCPA and the CPRA that Congress and the Biden-Harris administration will see that effort as the only way to go for U.S. privacy law?
Yeah, I think we'll see many states be pushing their local law as to the model to be held out. There are several proposals coming out of Washington and Virginia, California, that will certainly be on the table for consideration. But I think when you're looking at federal standards, there's sort of overarching policy considerations. I'll just add one thing, and I think I see Stu leaning into wanting to comment on the federal side. When we're looking at California, it's still a changing environment. While they passed the CPRA, it's not a final product. In fact, the CCPA is not yet final. There's still open regulations under consideration. Before we even get to the CPRA standing up an entirely new regulatory authority to promulgate new rules to implement the CPRA that won't go into effect for another 2 years. So that is still something being experimented and developed with, which may be a baseline when we talk about privacy rights, but again, in name only.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I've been doing privacy legislation for a long time, and I, we worked with Jessica Rich, former head of the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the FTC, in developing Privacy for America's standards. And I think that in most respects, if not all, the Privacy for America principles and framework we put forward are much stronger in the way that they would protect consumers and hit standards than is the California law. I'm not a particular fan of the California law because while it certainly, I think, is well-intentioned when you hear the drafters talk about it, I don't think it's the right way that laws should be passed. There are no dictators in this world, and ballot initiatives in some ways are really more the way that they actually get pursued. And I think you see, as we counsel companies, how much the definitions and lack of awareness of how the system really works, even though well-intended, doesn't map to what the law intends or claims. It becomes this crazy riddle that doesn't really further its goals. And you need look no further than the level of access requests in there. Very few. Companies have spent billions of dollars combined developing access tools for 20 consumers. It's not something that's particularly meaningful. What will be much more meaningful would be to define bad practices like we tried to do in P4A and said, consumers can be certain that these things aren't going to happen. And oh, by the way, all the benefits that come from the businesses that give them the unprecedented level of products and services fueled by the internet revolution, fueled by data, fueled by this industry, that's going to continue. Go ahead, Mike. Sorry, I get excited about this issue.
Well, we do have a question though from the audience about, given that it seems that Republicans and Democrats want to pass privacy legislation, what are the sticking points that you've seen?
Yeah, so on the federal level, two things that stick out that are more political than they are around this particular issue, but they come up on many issues, which are private cause of action, anything to do with the consumers, because there's a very powerful trial bar that has influence, and there's value in some types of consumer actions, and there's a history of that. There's also a real abuse that has been seen in private causes of actions and class actions, and so trying to thread that needles and always is a challenge. Preemption. There's a view of states' rights folks on both sides that would prefer to let the states do their things, which is really hard here. And then I do think you get into the issues of appropriate uses and what choices at opt-in or opt-out particular uses. So it's complex and they're riddles, but I think you get people on all, the interesting thing about these issues is everybody, all the policymakers are consumers too, as are we. So they have a view that transcends politics or business.
So when those politicians are wearing their political hats. So we've had a few questions about, will these laws apply to them when they're wearing their lawmaker hat?
Well, it's 50-50. Either they will or they won't. Look, there's First Amendment restrictions on all of the potential limitations on use of data, and they are particularly acute when you're trying to regulate speech, political speech. Look, data direct marketing has been one of the cornerstones to progressive and movements, civil rights movements in our country's history. The ability to reach people that share your views, to mobilize the public is a hugely important thing in our society. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. And so sometimes laws like telemarketing laws don't apply. And that's why. And there are limits on that. You know, I was involved years ago in the passing of the do not call legislation, working with the business community and others. And that law almost didn't pass, the federal law, because Congress, because it might have impacted individual congressmen's ability to solicit using the telephone. So it is a real question, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves.
Well, we only have a few moments left, but we do have another question from the audience about, we're hearing about privacy legislation, but there's also Section 230 reform and other legislative priorities. Where do you see privacy falling in line with that, and what other hot topics you think are going to emerge?
I think privacy comes in ahead of that. There's more attention on 230, but I think it's not as mature in what the potential solutions are. They may be related. There's telecom reform, which certainly could come up. But I think, at least in the Senate Commerce Committee, what we've heard from the members and the staff there is that this is in their top 3 priorities beyond COVID and stimulus, and then transportation, some transportation issues. So this is a top tier issue. So with that, let me thank you all for participating. Another great day at the ALM. Again, we look forward to seeing all of you in person next year. Mike promises to buy a drink for every one of you, as long as you ask him next year, if you remember that.
But I'm using Stu's card.
And have a great evening, and we'll see you back tomorrow.